The engineer's hand trembled as he held the telegram, its words blurring before his eyes in the dim light of the Luna chemical plant control room. It was May 12, 1944, and the message was simple, devastating, and marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As war machine, American bombers inbound. Estimated time, 14 minutes. Around him, technicians frantically shut down the massive Fischer-Tropsch reactors, the technological marvels that had been turning coal into gasoline for the Luftwaffe. These towering steel columns, filled with superheated catalysts and pressurized gases, could simply be switched off like a light bulb. The shutdown process took hours. The bombers would arrive in minutes. What made this moment truly catastrophic was just the impending destruction of Germany's largest synthetic fuel plant. It was the realization that had been slowly dawning on German high command for months. Their entire war effort had been built on a foundation of sand, or more precisely, on a foundation of coal that could never quite replace the oil they did have. This is the story of Germany's desperate gamble on synthetic fuel, a technological achievement that was both brilliant and doomed, a scientific triumph that could overcome strategic reality, and the hidden vulnerability that would ultimately ground the Luftwaffe, strand Panzer divisions, and help bring the Third Reich to its knees. The roots of Germany's fuel crisis stretched back decades before the 1st Panzer crossed into Poland. In 1918, as the Kaiser's Germany collapsed in defeat, military analysts conducted brutal post-mortems of why they had lost the Great War. Among the countless factors, American intervention, the naval blockade, political upheaval, one stood out with crystalline clarity. Germany had run out of fuel. The British Royal Navy's blockade had strangled Germany's access to imported petroleum. By 1918, German trucks were running on benzene extracted from coal tar. Submarines were rationing fuel for training exercises, and the vaunted German army was increasingly immobile. Horses, which had been supposed to be obsolete in modern warfare, became critical again simply because they didn't require gasoline. The lesson was seared into German military thinking. Never again could Germany enter a major conflict dependent on imported oil. The problem was geological and immutable. Germany had virtually no natural petroleum reserves. The earth beneath the Ruhr Valley held vast deposits of high-quality coal, but not a single drop of crude oil worth extracting. In the 1920s, as Germany's defeated military plotted its eventual resurgence, a group of chemists offered an audacious solution. What if coal could be transformed into oil? Not just any oil, but high-quality gasoline, diesel fuel, and aviation fuel, chemically identical to petroleum products. The concept was an pure fantasy. Two German scientists, Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch, had developed a process in 1925 that could convert coal into liquid hydrocarbons. Meanwhile, chemist Friedrich Burgess had pioneered a different method: direct coal hydrogenation that could achieve similar results through a different chemical pathway. Both processes were staggeringly complex, requiring enormous facilities, extreme temperatures and pressures, exotic catalysts, and massive amounts of electricity. But they worked. By 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany had several small-scale synthetic fuel plants operating. They were expensive, inefficient, and produced fuel at costs far higher than simply importing petroleum. Under normal economic circumstances, they made no sense whatsoever. But Hitler wasn't planning normal economic circumstances. He was planning for war. One of the first people to recognize the strategic implications of synthetic fuel was Karl Krauch, a brilliant chemist who had risen to become a director at AG Farben, Germany's massive chemical conglomerate. In a meeting with Hermann Göttering in 1936, Crouch laid out a vision that would shape Germany's entire approach to the coming conflict. "Give me 4 years and unlimited resources," Crouch reportedly said, "and I can make Germany independent of foreign oil." It was exactly what the Nazi leadership wanted to hear. Göttering, who headed Germany's 4-year plan for economic preparation for war, immediately authorized a massive expansion of synthetic fuel production. The goal was audacious. By 1940, Germany would produce enough synthetic fuel to meet all military requirements. Even under total blockade, money poured into synthetic fuel plants across Germany. Luna, P. for Litz, B. Wellen, Zeitz, Bleckhammer. These chemical facilities grew into industrial cities unto themselves. The Luna plant alone employed over 35,000 workers at its peak, sprawling across thousands of acres with reactor towers that dominated the skyline like industrial cathedrals. The scale of investment was staggering. By 1944, Germany had poured over 3 billion Reichsmarks into synthetic fuel production, equivalent to roughly $30 billion today. This was money that didn't go into tanks, aircraft, or ships. It was a massive strategic bet that coal chemistry could replace geology, and remarkably, it almost worked. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you are watching from and what you know about Germany's synthetic fuel program. Drop a comment below and let me know if you heard about this crucial aspect of World War II before. And if you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden vulnerabilities that shaped the war's outcome, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you are out there makes it all worthwhile. By 1939, as German tanks rolled into Poland, the synthetic fuel program had achieved something remarkable. Germany was producing approximately 46 million barrels of synthetic fuel annually, roughly 72% of its total liquid fuel supply. For a nation with essentially no natural oil reserves, this was an extraordinary achievement. The plants operated on 2 main processes, each with its own advantages and complications. The Bergius process, used at plants like Luna, subjected pulverized coal to extreme pressure, up to 700 atmospheres, and temperatures around 400 degrees Celsius in the presence of hydrogen and catalysts. Under these brutal conditions, the complex carbon structures in coal broke down and recombined into the simpler hydrocarbon chains that make up gasoline and diesel. The Fischer-Tropsch process, used at facilities like Pfalz, took a different approach. Coal was first gasified to produce synthesis gas, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which was then catalytically converted into liquid hydrocarbons at somewhat lower pressures and temperatures. The process was slightly less efficient than Bergius hydrogenation, but more flexible in the types of fuels it could produce. Both processes were technological marvels. The engineering required to maintain such extreme conditions on an industrial scale was extraordinary. The reactors were massive pressure vessels lined with special alloys that could withstand corrosive chemicals at high temperatures. The catalyst systems required rare metals like cobalt, molybdenum, and nickel. The hydrogen production alone required entire subsidiary plants. Captain Hans Miller, a Luftwaffe logistics officer who toured the Luna facility in 1940, was overwhelmed by the complexity. "Walking through the plant was like entering a different world," he wrote in his diary. "Everywhere, pipes as thick as a man's body, carrying superheated gases under pressures that would tear a submarine apart. The noise was deafening, the roar of furnaces, the hiss of steam, the thunder of compressors, and over it all, the chemical smell, acrid and unnatural, that burned in your throat. The workers explained that each reactor produced about 100 tons of gasoline. Per Dalton Y. It seemed miraculous. Coal going in one end, fuel for our fighters coming out the other. They were so proud, these chemists and engineers. They believed they had solved Germany's greatest strategic weakness. They had no idea how fragile their miracle really was. The fragility was immediately apparent. In the early years of the war, the synthetic fuel program seemed vindicated. The blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries were fuel-intensive but short. German panzers raced across Europe on synthetic gasoline. Luftwaffe bombers flew on synthetic aviation fuel, and U-boats prowled the Atlantic on synthetic diesel. Germany supplemented its synthetic production with captured oil stocks, petroleum from neutral Romania, and fuel seized from conquered territories. By mid-1941, German fuel supplies seemed adequate for the Wehrmacht's needs. Then came Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was a monster that devoured fuel at rates German planners had never anticipated. The vast distances of Russia meant German supply trucks consumed enormous quantities of fuel, just reaching the front lines. Panzer divisions, advancing hundreds of miles in weeks, burned through fuel allocations meant to last months. The brutal Russian winter required vehicles to keep engines running constantly to prevent freezing, wasting fuel even when stationary. Colonel Heinz Guderian, whose panzer armies were driving toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, watched his offensive slowly grind to a halt as fuel trucks failed to keep pace with his advancing tanks. "We are racing forward," he wrote in October 1941, "but always we are one fuel delivery away from stopping completely. The panzers sit idle for days, waiting for tankers that are themselves out of fuel hundreds of kilometers behind us. High Command assures us that synthetic fuel production is increasing, that new plants are coming online, but the mathematics are brutal. We are consuming fuel faster than Germany can possibly produce it, even with all the chemists and reactors in the Reich working at maximum capacity." The problem was one of fundamental physics and chemistry. Synthetic fuel production, for all its technological sophistication, was inherently inefficient. The Fischer-Tropsch process converted only about 25 to 30% of the coal's energy content into liquid fuel. The Burgess process was better at around 50%, but still meant that enormous quantities of coal were required to produce relatively modest amounts of gasoline. Germany had abundant coal, but mining it, transporting it to chemical plants, and processing it through the complex synthesis required massive industrial infrastructure and huge amounts of electricity. Each liter of synthetic fuel represented hours of work by miners, engineers, chemists, and plant operators. By contrast, crude oil simply had to be pumped from the ground and refined, a much simpler and more efficient process. The synthetic fuel plants had another critical vulnerability that became apparent only gradually. They were massive, fixed installations that could be hidden or easily defended. Each major facility was a city-sized complex of reactors, storage tanks, and pipelines. The Luna plant covered over 2 square miles. These installations could be spotted from the air miles away, their distinctive reactor towers and storage facilities making them unmistakable targets. In the early war years, this hadn't mattered. British bombers lacked the range and accuracy to effectively strike targets deep inside Germany. Attacks were scattered and caused minimal damage. The synthetic fuel plants continued operating around the clock, their output steadily increasing as new capacity came online. But Allied air power was evolving rapidly. By 1943, the United States Army Air Force had deployed hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses to bases in England. These 4 Engine bombers could carry massive bomb loads deep into Germany in daylight, escorted by long-range P-51 Mustang fighters. The British RAF continued its nighttime area bombing campaign with Lancasters and Halifaxes. Allied planners studying Germany's economy for vulnerable pressure points gradually recognized what German strategists had feared all along. Synthetic fuel was the Third Reich's Achilles. The man who would turn this recognition into devastating reality was General Karl Spaatz, commanding the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. In early 1944, Spaatz received a comprehensive intelligence report on Germany's fuel situation prepared by the Enemy Oil Committee, a group of petroleum engineers and economists analyzing German production. The report's conclusions were stark. Germany had exactly 14 major synthetic fuel plants producing the vast majority of its liquid fuel. These plants were fixed, identifiable, and theoretically vulnerable to strategic bombing. If production could be significantly reduced, the entire German war machine, Luftwaffe, Panzers, U-boats, trucks, would grind to a halt regardless of how many weapons Germany manufactured. Spaatz immediately grasped the strategic implications. We don't need to destroy every tank factory, every aircraft plant, every ship, he told his staff in March 1944. We need to destroy the fuel that makes all those weapons move. Without fuel, their tanks are sculptures. Their planes are lawn ornaments. On May 12, 1944, Spaatz launched the campaign that would break Germany's synthetic fuel system forever. The target was the Luna plant, Germany's largest and most productive synthetic fuel facility, located near Merseburg in central Germany. The mission required 935B-17 bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters. It was one of the largest single raids of the entire war. German defenders threw everything they had at the bomber stream. Hundreds of fighters, massed flak batteries that turned the sky black with explosions. 35 American bombers were shot down, 350 airmen killed or captured. But the bombs found their target. The destruction was catastrophic. High explosive bombs tore apart reactor buildings. Incendiary bombs ignited fuel storage tanks, creating firestorms that burned for days. Most devastating were the bombs that ruptured high-pressure reactor vessels, causing chemical explosions that magnified the damage exponentially. When the smoke cleared, Luna's production had been reduced by 75%. The plant that had been producing nearly 4,000 tons of fuel daily was suddenly producing fewer than 1,000 tons. And it was just the beginning. Over the following months, American bombers returned again and again to Luna and Germany's other synthetic fuel plants. The campaign was relentless and systematic. As soon as German repair crews got one plant partially operational, it was bombed again. The Allies had discovered that synthetic fuel plants, unlike conventional refineries, could quickly recover from damage. The complex reactors, precise catalyst systems, and high-pressure vessels required months to repair even minor damage. The Germans fought desperately to protect their fuel plants. They surrounded them with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, making the synthetic fuel complexes the most heavily defended targets in Germany. They deployed smoke generators that could blanket entire plants in artificial fog, making precision bombing nearly impossible. They moved fighter squadrons to nearby airfields, specifically to defend the fuel installations. Reichsminister Albert Speer, in charge of German armaments production, recognized the mortal danger. In June 1944, he wrote to Hitler, "The enemy has struck us at our most vulnerable point. If they continue the fuel plant attacks and our defenses prove insufficient, it means the loss of the war within a few months." Hitler, characteristically, refused to believe the situation was as dire as Speer claimed. He ordered priority given to repairing bombed plants and constructing new ones, including audacious plans for underground synthetic fuel facilities that would be immune to bombing. But the damage was accelerating faster than repairs could proceed. By July 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel production had fallen to 35% of its May levels. By September, it was down to 17%. The numbers translated into immediate consequences on every front. Luftwaffe training flights were cut drastically. New pilots who had once received 200 hours of flight training before combat deployment now received 50 hours or less. They were sent to face veteran American and British pilots flying superior aircraft with inadequate skills and dwindling fuel supplies. Major Werner Melders, a Luftwaffe logistics officer, watched the deterioration with despair. In August 1944, I received fuel allocations that were 40% of what we had in May, he recorded. Squadron commanders had to choose which pilots would fly and which would remain grounded. Mechanics siphoned fuel from damaged aircraft to keep operational ones flying. By September, the situation became surreal. We had aircraft, hundreds of them. We had pilots, albeit poorly trained. We had ammunition, but the aircraft sat silently on the tarmac because we had no fuel to put in them. The Reich had the fourth largest air force in the world, rendered impotent by chemistry and American bombs. On the ground, Panzer divisions faced similar paralysis. The Wehrmacht had designed its entire doctrine around mobile warfare, rapid armored thrusts, supported by mechanized infantry. Without fuel, this doctrine collapsed. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive, Panzer divisions were allocated fuel for only 100 kilometers of movement. The plan relied on capturing American fuel depots to continue the advance. When those captures failed to materialize, German armor literally ran dry in the middle of battle. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Paper, commanding a battle group of King Tiger tanks during the Bulge offensive, watched helplessly as his powerful tanks rolled to a stop. We had destroyed 2 American tank battalions, he later testified. The road to the Meuse was open before us, but we sat motionless in the Belgian snow because our fuel trucks had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. I had the finest tanks in the world, commanded by experienced crews facing weak opposition. And we could advance a single kilometer. This was the reality of Germany's fuel crisis, tactical victories that could be exploited because the fuel simply did exist. The Germans made desperate attempts to salvage their fuel situation. They accelerated the construction of underground synthetic fuel plants, massive cavern complexes carved into mountains, where reactors would be immune to bombing. But these facilities required years to complete and would produce a single liter of fuel until long after the war's outcome had been decided. They attempted to develop alternative fuel sources, wood gas generators for trucks, alcohol fuels from potatoes, even experiments with fuels derived from garbage and sewage. Some of these worked on a small scale, but none could replace the high energy density of petroleum products that modern military machines required. They hoarded every drop of captured fuel. When Soviet petroleum facilities at Ploiești in Romania were overrun, the loss was catastrophic. Those oil fields had been supplying about 35% of Germany's total fuel consumption. German chemists worked frantically to improve synthetic fuel production efficiency, developing new catalysts and refining techniques. But fundamental chemistry could be overcome. Making fuel from coal would always be more complex and less efficient than refining crude oil. By early 1945, the situation had become terminal. Germany's remaining synthetic fuel plants were producing less than 10% of their 1944 capacity. The Luftwaffe was almost entirely grounded, not because of aircraft losses, but because of fuel exhaustion. The vaunted Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, potentially a war-winning technology, sat idle because the synthetic fuel plants could too produce the special jet fuel it required. Panzer divisions were immobilized across Germany, their powerful tanks abandoned on roadsides when fuel ran out, later captured intact by advancing Allied armies. The U-boat fleet, which had terrorized Allied shipping for years, found itself trapped in port. Submarines required enormous quantities of diesel for their ocean patrols. As fuel supplies dwindled, fewer boats could sortie, and those that did had to carefully ration fuel for their return journey. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, recognized how completely the fuel crisis had paralyzed German forces. In March 1945, he wrote, "The enemy has aircraft. He has tanks. He has artillery. What he doesn't have is the fuel to make them effective. The German military is dying not from wounds in battle, but from slow asphyxiation as its fuel supply strangles." The final irony came in April 1945, as Soviet forces approached the Luna plant, the massive facility that had once been Germany's fuel lifeline. German demolition teams prepared to destroy the plant rather than let it fall intact into Soviet hands. But they could complete the demolition. They didn't have enough explosives, and more critically, they didn't have enough fuel to power the trucks that would have hauled the demolition charges into position. The Soviets captured Luna largely intact, though heavily damaged by years of Allied bombing. They would later use German expertise to build their own synthetic fuel industry, a technology transfer achieved through conquest rather than cooperation. When the war ended in May 1945, Germany's fuel situation provided a stark lesson in strategic vulnerability. The nation had achieved remarkable technological sophistication in synthetic fuel production. German chemists and engineers had solved incredibly complex problems, building an industry from scratch that turned coal into gasoline, with remarkable efficiency given the chemical challenges involved. But all that ingenuity could overcome fundamental strategic realities. Synthetic fuel production was inherently inefficient, enormously resource-intensive, and dependent on vulnerable fixed installations. No amount of scientific brilliance could change those facts. The numbers tell the story starkly. At peak production in early 1944, Germany's synthetic fuel plants were producing about 124,000 barrels per Dalton Y. By comparison, the United States was producing over 4.7 million barrels per Dalton Y from conventional petroleum sources. Germany's entire synthetic fuel output, achieved through massive investment and technological sophistication, amounted to less than 3% of American petroleum production. The strategic asymmetry was overwhelming. America could lose refineries to accidents, sabotage, or attack and barely notice the impact on overall production. Germany lost a handful of synthetic fuel plants and saw its entire military capability collapse. After the war, Allied intelligence teams thoroughly investigated Germany's synthetic fuel program. The technical achievements impressed them, the engineering was sophisticated, the chemistry was advanced, and the scale of industrial organization was remarkable. American petroleum engineers, examining the facilities, wrote detailed reports praising German innovation, but they also noted the fundamental futility of the entire enterprise. One American report concluded, Germany's synthetic fuel program represents an impressive technical achievement in service of a strategic impossibility. No nation without natural petroleum resources can sustain modern mechanized warfare against opponents with abundant oil. Regardless of how clever their chemists or how dedicated their engineers, the program had consumed resources that might have been better used elsewhere. The 3 billion Reichsmarks invested in synthetic fuel plants could have built thousands of additional tanks or aircraft. The tens of thousands of workers employed in chemical plants could have manned factories producing conventional weapons. The massive electrical power consumption of the synthetic fuel plants, about 10% of Germany's total electricity generation, could have powered aluminum smelters for aircraft production or steel mills for tank construction. Germany had bet everything on chemistry overcoming geology, and chemistry had lost. The legacy of Germany's synthetic fuel crisis extended far beyond World War II. During the Cold War, both superpowers studied the German experience carefully, learning opposite lessons. The Soviet Union, scarred by wartime fuel shortages and mindful of potential blockades, invested heavily in coal, too, liquid fuel technology, based on captured German plants and expertise. For decades, the USSR maintained synthetic fuel capacity as a strategic reserve. The United States took a different lesson. Secure access to natural petroleum was paramount. American post-war strategy prioritized relationships with oil-producing regions, particularly the Middle East. The security of petroleum supply lines became a cornerstone of American military planning. South Africa, facing international sanctions in the 1970s and 1980s, built a massive synthetic fuel industry using German Fischer-Tropsch technology. The Sasol plants proved that coal-to-liquid technology could work on a large scale, but only with substantial government subsidies, and when conventional petroleum was unavailable. Today, several nations maintain coal-to-liquid facilities, but they are economically viable only under specific conditions: abundant, cheap coal, expensive oil prices, or political isolation that limits conventional petroleum access. The fundamental economics haven't changed since 1944. Making fuel from coal is always more expensive and complex than refining crude oil. The story of Germany's synthetic fuel program stands as one of history's great examples of technological sophistication failing to overcome strategic disadvantage. German chemists achieved something remarkable. They turned coal into gasoline on an industrial scale, solving problems that lesser talents would have found insurmountable. But brilliance was enough. Geography mattered. Germany didn't have oil fields, and no amount of chemical engineering could fully compensate for that fundamental reality. The synthetic fuel plants, for all their technical sophistication, were vulnerable fixed targets that could survive sustained attack. In the end, Germany's fuel crisis teaches us that wars aren't won solely by technological innovation or battlefield courage. Strategic resources, boring, unromantic things like petroleum geology and refining capacity, can be just as decisive as the newest weapons or most brilliant tactics. The Panzer divisions that conquered Europe in 1940 and the Luftwaffe that terrorized Allied bombers didn't ultimately lose because of inferior designs or cowardly crews. They lost because the fuel tanks ran empty, the synthetic fuel plants burned, and no amount of chemical genius could conjure petroleum from coal fast enough to keep pace with the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. That is the story of Germany's synthetic fuel program. A triumph of science and engineering that could overcome the simple fact that modern warfare requires oil, and Germany didn't have any. The chemists and engineers at Luna and Pfudilitz had achieved something remarkable. But remarkable wasn't enough when the bombers came. when the fuel stopped flowing, and when the tanks rolled to a silent stop on roads across a dying Reich. The greatest vulnerability isn't always on the battlefield. Sometimes it is in the chemistry or the lack of it.